Over 100 years ago, inside the yards of Bethlehem Steel, there was a moment almost no one noticed. Thousands of workers were moving iron ore, coke, refined coal, and limestone, the raw materials that made up the Industrial Revolution. The work was physical, repetitive, and constant. And yet it wasn't structured. Workers shoveled the way they had always shoveled. They chose tools based on habit, learned their form by watching others, and worked in bursts as their energy rose and fell throughout the day. No one questioned it, because this was simply how the work was done. Until Frederick Winslow Taylor started watching. Taylor didn't begin with a solution. He began with a question. What if the way this work is being done isn't the best way to do it? So he studied it. He redesigned the shovel. Larger blades for lighter materials, smaller blades for heavier ones. He defined posture, standardized motion, and introduced a process where none had existed. And something remarkable happened. Productivity surged. Not because the workers changed, but because the way the work was done changed. That moment became the foundation of modern management, what we now refer to as Taylorism. And whether we realize it or not, that thinking still shapes almost every organization today. More importantly, we are standing in a moment that looks eerily similar. In conversations I keep having with professionals, a divide is forming, and it's accelerating. On one side, people are questioning their work. They're rethinking how they write, research, plan, and communicate. They're experimenting with new tools. They're discovering that many tasks don't need to be done the way they've always been done. They are, in a very real sense, redesigning their shovel. On the other side, people are still working the way they did 5, 10 years ago. Still drafting emails from scratch, still running meetings without recording or synthesizing them, still researching manually as if an entirely different way of doing that work doesn't exist, moving through their routines as if nothing fundamental has changed. The gap between these two groups is not intelligence. It's not effort. It's not even access to tools. It comes down to something much more subtle and much more difficult to see while you're in the middle of your work. It's discernment. Discernment is the ability to step back and examine how you're working while you're still doing the work. It's the pause that allows you to question patterns that otherwise run automatically. It's what creates just enough distance between you and your habits to actually see them, to ask clearly and honestly, why am I doing it this way? Where did I learn to do it this way? And is this still the best way to approach this work, given what has changed around me? Without that pause, habits don't just continue, they compound. They become embedded in how we operate, reinforced by repetition, and eventually invisible to us. What once may have been effective becomes the default. And because it still works at some level, it never gets questioned. That is where the risk begins to build. Because if you are not actively practicing discernment, not just individually, but across your team, you won't feel the gap forming in real time. You will continue operating as you always have, assuming the way you are working is still sufficient, until the distance between how the work could be done and how it is being done becomes too large to ignore. And by then, it is no longer a small adjustment. It is a reset. This week, I'm sharing 3 signals drawn from conversations with transformation leaders, HR leaders, founders, and independent consultants. Across each of them, the same pattern is emerging. The tools available to us are becoming more powerful, while our ability to use them clearly, with intention, and with awareness is being tested. But before we jump into the signals, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. Here are 3 stories from this week that point to this massive shift. The first story: our attention is thinning. In multiple conversations this week with solopreneurs working to grow their business and their voice across platforms like Substack, YouTube, LinkedIn, the same pattern kept surfacing. It is not just becoming harder to get attention, it is becoming harder to hold it. And even when attention is captured, follow-through is increasingly inconsistent. People express intent, but the action rarely materializes. At first glance, this gets interpreted as a content problem or an execution problem. But across these conversations, it is starting to look like something else entirely. It is not that people do not care. It is that their attention cannot stay. It moves quickly from one input to the next, rarely settling long enough to engage deeply, make a decision, or follow through with intention. This does not present itself as a lack of discipline. It presents as a reduction in capacity. The ability to hold attention long enough to think, reflect, and act is being stretched thin. And that has deeper implications than it appears, because the same capacity required to stay focused on a task is the capacity required to step back and question the task itself, to examine whether the way we are working is still effective, to interrupt patterns that have become automatic. If that capacity is eroding, then so is our ability to practice discernment. And without discernment, our habits persist, unquestioned, unchanged, and increasingly misaligned with the environment around us. The signal. The cognitive capacity required to question how we work is thinning at the same moment it is needed most. The second story. Precision in our language matters more than ever. In conversations this week with HR leaders, I kept hearing the same phrases. We need more strategic thinking, or we need to scale AI adoption. On the surface, these sound clear, but when you ask a simple question like, "What do you mean by that?" everything starts to break down. Very few people can clearly articulate what they actually mean. This is not a reflection of capability. The individuals saying these things are impressive beyond measure. What it reveals is something more subtle. The terms have become so familiar that we take for granted what we are actually trying to say. We assume they are understood the same way by everyone. In reality, they are not. Each person interprets these words through the lens of their own experience, their own pressures, and their own understanding of the work. Without clearly defining what is meant, everyone fills in the gaps differently. As a result, different people, using the same language, are often talking about completely different things, and no one realizes it. This becomes a real problem when you consider the context these leaders are operating in. Every one of them is trying to orchestrate alignment across teams, stakeholders, and the broader organization. But when language is imprecise, alignment becomes impossible. And when alignment is impossible, work turns into friction disguised as progress. Meetings multiply, and conversations repeat themselves. Initiatives stall because motion replaces meaningful execution. Teams move, but not together and not in the same direction. Part of questioning our work habits is not just about what we do. It is about the words we use to describe what we are doing, and whether those words are actually understood in the same way by the people we are asking to move with us. Because language does not just communicate the work, it actually shapes it. The signal. Teams are using the same words, but not meaning the same things. If you are curious about the precision of your own language, then check out this week's sponsor, Anicca. Anicca is an AI tool that analyzes your real conversations and gives you feedback on how you're actually showing up. Not how you think you are, but what the data shows. It looks at patterns like generative versus constrictive language, talk time versus listen time, questions versus statements, clarity versus abstraction. So you can begin to see the patterns that are shaping your conversations and your outcomes. Sign up to start analyzing the hidden patterns in your language at web.anicca.app. The third story from this week: assumptions going unquestioned. In multiple conversations this week with leaders navigating change, a quieter pattern kept emerging beneath the surface of the discussion. Not disagreement or resistance, but assumptions, operating in the background, rarely named, and almost never examined. In one conversation about rolling out a culture initiative, there was a moment where someone stated, with confidence, that the local facility would resist. The statement landed, and the conversation moved forward, as if it were fact. No one questioned where it came from. No one asked whether the conditions that made it true in the past were still present now. It simply became the premise that shaped the rest of the discussion. But when the group slowed down long enough to examine it, something shifted. Many of the individuals involved in prior efforts were no longer there. The context had changed, the people had changed, the situation was not the same. Only the assumption was. And this is the pattern that is important to start to notice. Assumptions formed in past conditions continue to shape present decisions, even when the environment they were formed in no longer exists. They operate quietly, but they are not neutral. They influence how problems are defined, how strategies are built, and how people prepare for what they believe will happen next. In many cases, they become self-fulfilling. Not because they are accurate, but because they were never questioned. This matters in how we work, because discernment is not just about questioning our actions. It is about questioning the assumptions those actions are built on. And when assumptions go unexamined, they don't just describe reality, they begin to shape it. The signal. Unexamined assumptions are quietly shaping decisions, even when the conditions they were built on have already changed. Individually, these signals might feel insignificant. Short attention spans, imprecise language, unexamined assumptions. But when you step back and look at them together, they point to something deeper. At the exact moment when the tools available to us are becoming more powerful, our ability to use them with clarity, intention, and awareness is being tested. When attention thins, we lose the pause. When language blurs, we lose the alignment. When assumptions go unexamined, we lose sight of reality itself. And all three are happening at the same time. The real shift here isn't technological. It's a shift in awareness. Just like in Bethlehem Steel, the advantage didn't go to the people who worked harder. It went to the people who were willing to step back and question the way the work was being done. And today, the same is true. The divide is not between those who have access to AI and those who don't. It is between those who are willing to question their habits and those who are still operating on patterns they have never stopped to examine. The shovel has changed. The question is whether you have. If this resonates, join us as we explore what it means to lead, live, and work in an era of accelerating change.